I mean, he's someone who it radiates, if you like, seriousness. He doesn't smile very much. He's very kind of businesslike. But he also, I think, is very much in command of facts, which he's interested in, and he can also be quite sarcastic when he wants to be.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Putin Files. Today we've had Angela Stent on the show. She's a Putin biographer. She's broken down who Vladimir Putin is, how he became one of the most well-known dictators, his transition from a KGB officer to becoming the president of Russia, how he became the person he is today before he invaded Ukraine. So we discussed that. We discussed his childhood. We discussed his inner circle. So all that today on the Putin Files. Angela Stent, thank you so much for joining the Putin Files today.
I'm glad to be on your show.
Well, it's one of our first episodes today, so we wanted to kind of keep it basic and get into Vladimir Putin in more of an analytical sense as opposed to just covering the war, and speak to you about who he was, how he grew up, because of course no one knows him better than you as a Putin biographer. So to kickstart, I wanted to ask you just such a basic question of who is Vladimir Putin?
Well, what we do know about him, he was born in 1952 in post-war Leningrad. Leningrad had been under siege for 1,000 days by the Nazis, and 1 million people had died, including one of his brothers. Many people died of starvation. So he was born, just a few years after the end of World War II. His father had been a cook, and the family lived in one of these typical Soviet communal apartments where you had several families in one flat sharing a kitchen and a bathroom and everything else. So he grew up poor. Much of what we know about his early life comes from some interviews that he gave in the year at the end of 1999 when he was about to become president. We don't know how much of this is true, but these are the interviews he gave to a couple of journalists. And then he talked about growing up poor in this communal flat, about being a very indifferent student at school, about being bullied by other children. Again, this is all in this autobiographical book, First Person. And then what redeemed him were two things. He started to get into martial arts when he was a boy. And also he had a German teacher who apparently believed in him and thought that he could do better in school than he did. So by the time he'd finished school, he was a judo champion, actually. He was one of the judo champions of Leningrad as a young man. He did learn German. And then he went to university in Leningrad. He studied law. Apparently he wanted to join the KGB at least at the age of 16, and he went round to them and asked them whether he could join, and they said, come back later when you've got your degree. But then when he did finish his degree, he did join the KGB. Now, that the secret police in the Soviet times, the elite part of that was in Moscow. He was in Leningrad, so it was already a provincial branch of the KGB. But because he did know German, he was then sent in 1985 to East Germany, to Dresden, which was a city, one of the few cities in the GDR at that point that did not get West German television, which many others didn't. So you had a population that was still very much ignorant of what was going on in the West. And he was a case officer. And in this book, First Person, he says, I worked with people and I organized things. So he was a mid-level he became a lieutenant colonel in the end, but he was a mid-level KGB case officer and apparently enjoyed being there. And I think what one has to know is that he missed the Gorbachev years. So between 1985 and 1990, when Gorbachev was in power, everything was opening up in the Soviet Union. People were questioning what had come beforehand. He missed that. He was in one of the most repressive countries in Eastern Europe, East Germany. And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And at that point, they didn't know what to do, the KGB officers. And they got no instructions from Moscow. And as the Berlin Wall fell, a mob of people in Dresden came to the headquarters of the KGB, which was co-located with the East German secret police, and they demanded to see their files. And so Putin was stuck inside this building with his colleagues, burning all the documents they had. At one point, the furnace exploded because they were putting too many documents into it. And that was basically the end of his career as a KGB officer in East Germany. And so the next year, he went back to Moscow. He was unemployed for a while. But I think the important thing to remember about this is that he had this promising career as a KGB agent. It was cut short by the fall of the Berlin Wall. He felt that Moscow had abandoned the people who were working in East Germany, and he came back really not knowing what his future was. So for him, the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union was something deeply personal because it was something that shattered, presumably, his hopes for what he was going to become.
Is it a normal transition, Angela, going from an officer in the KGB to working in Russian politics to then becoming a president? So he only had around 8 years working in politics, because if we compare it, I know it's not completely comparable, but if you compare it to, say, an American working in the CIA and then, moving into US politics and only 8 years later becoming the US president.
Yeah, it's extremely unusual. And in the Soviet period, people who were in the KGB didn't make that kind of transition. I mean, what Putin then did is he eventually, after kind of cooling his heels in what was now known as St. Petersburg, after the Soviet collapse, he became the deputy mayor responsible for economic contacts with the West. And as far as we know, that's when he made these contacts with Western businesses, and he started to accumulate money with some of his colleagues. But it was a very unusual transition. And then what happened to him was that the mayor he was serving, Anatoly Sobchak, was ousted in an election in 1996. It was not a clean election. And I think another lesson that Putin learned from that election was elections aren't any good if you can't predict who's going to win. So his boss lost. The boss then had to leave office. He later died. And then Putin eventually did get a position. He was sent to Moscow, and he rose rather quickly through the ranks. But I think that's another lesson he learned from living in St. Petersburg in the 1990s.
Was he elected in 2000, when he officially became the Russian president, was he elected democratically?
I mean, what happened was that Boris Yeltsin, who was the first post-communist president, was by that time very ill. He had and couldn't really serve any longer. He was supposed to remain in office until the spring of 2000, and he went through 7 different prime ministers. He then picked Putin as the last prime minister, and I think it's important to remember that at that point, what Yeltsin was looking for was someone who would protect his family interests once he was no longer president. The only transitions of power that we know about in the hundreds of years of Russian history were either death by natural causes, death by unnatural causes. Tsars were murdered by their relatives and by other people. And so this was the first time you had this handover of power. And he chose Putin because Putin was a little known, really, ex-KGB functionary who seemed loyal. And what he did was he promised Yeltsin that his family would not be prosecuted once he became president. And he did stick to that promise. So he was elected and then Yeltsin handed over power prematurely to Putin at the very end of 1999. There was then an election in the year 2000, but even that election, I would say, was already rigged. There were other political parties there, but you cannot say that it was a fully democratic election. So he did come to power in a competitive election, but heavily weighted in his favor.
Was he always, from an early age, and from what we know from documentation and history, was he always showing these kind of cunning and ambitious qualities to be able to skip these steps, or be able to, obviously growing up in such a poor household, to be able to get in the right rooms with the right people?
So all we know is that there's an evaluation apparently from the KGB that was made when he was there as a young man, saying that he took too many risks, questioning the wisdom of some of his moves. But I think, it was the combination of being a case officer and also, I would say, a judo champion, where you have to understand how to outwit your opponent, even if that opponent's stronger than you. It did give him some qualities of understanding how to manipulate people. And obviously, we've seen those on display very much in the 25 years that he's been in power.
You mentioned that he'd always kind of wanting to revert back to those Soviet Union days because he felt personal about them. But when he was elected in 2000, was he popular at all? Was he outspoken about the fact that he wanted to go back to the Soviet Union?
No, he was not outspoken about that at all. So in the early 1990s, he told the American consul in St. Petersburg that he didn't believe that the fall of the Soviet Union was legal, that he regretted it very much, and that he would hope to somehow restore, if not the Soviet Union, at least Russia as a great power. But when he came to power, he initially published something called a millennial statement, Russia on the eve of the millennium, where he sounded more kind of forward-leaning and saying, we have to reform and we have to, I'm going to bring stability to you. So he was not upfront early on that he believed that the Soviet Union, in fact, had illegally dissolved, which is something that the Russians have been saying for some time, and particularly in recent weeks.
Is that a common conception within Russia, as you just mentioned, that everyday Russians wanted to go back to the Soviet Union, or is it more stemming from the top?
So I think for many Russians, the 1990s was very difficult in this chaotic transition away from a state-controlled economy and a communist system. A few people got extremely rich, but a lot of people lost money. There were financial crises. It was unpredictable. They lost their pensions. They didn't know if they were going to get their wages the next week. So what Putin has done is that he has, in some ways, exploited this kind of concern about what happened in the 1990s, and when he came back again saying he was going to restore order, to make many Russians believe that they had a much better system when it was less democratic, because democracy meant chaos and it also meant poverty.
Does he have a lot of enemies within Russia still, Angela? We obviously know that he has his ways of getting rid of them, but in terms of normal Russian civilians, do you find that there is a lot of protesting or a lot of anti-Kremlin rhetoric going on?
Well, by now there's practically no protest going on because the system is so repressive that if you as much as mention that you question the wisdom of prosecuting a war against Ukraine, you can get arrested, you can get jailed. So much of the opposition has left since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. They're living in Europe, they're living in the US, they're living in other parts of the world. The people who've remained, many of them now have bought into his narrative of the necessity of the war and the necessity of jailing and arresting people who oppose him, particularly people who use state-run media. Of course, there are people in Russia who oppose him and oppose the war, but they're very quiet because otherwise they risk arrest. And even during this war with Ukraine, the mothers and the wives of soldiers who've fought, who haven't come back, they don't know what's happened to them, they have been really unable to protest because of the repression. Whereas if you compare it to what happened in the late 1980s during the Soviet-Afghan war, you had a very active group of what was called soldiers' mothers protesting against it, and that partly influenced Mikhail Gorbachev, then the president of the Soviet Union, to end the war. So whatever opposition there is has really been silenced, as major opposition figures like Alexei Navalny were killed, people have been poisoned, they've been threatened, so there's real intimidation there.
Can you walk me through Putin's inner circle? Are they long-time loyalists that have stuck by him since the beginning of his reign?
Well, as far as we know, yes, his inner circle consists of people who either have official positions or don't have official positions, because this is very much a one-man personalist rule. And he's known most of them for a very long time. Many of them come from the security and intelligence services, and those people are loyal to him, and those are the people whom he talks to. But this is a very opaque system, again, run by someone who is a former intelligence officer, with many of his colleagues who were as well. And so there's only a limited amount to what we know. And one of Putin's former advisors, who then left him, warned people that people who talk don't know, and people who know don't talk. So there's a lot that we don't know about the inner workings of this system.
Wow, it's terrifying stuff. And these people that Putin has in his corner, Angela, are they mostly men?
Oh, yes. This is a very male-dominated system. I would say there is no woman that I can think of who is really in his corner. There are some women who have high-level positions, including Putin's niece, who's now the deputy defense minister. But these are not people who have a major influence. This is a very male-dominated system.
Knowing the little that we know about his upbringing and a relationship with his mother, can you look at Vladimir Putin and think he's someone that does have an issue with women in power?
I don't know whether it's him. I mean, I think it's the society in general. Russian society is very male chauvinist. I've had experiences where it's clear to me that, Russian officials, not only officials, but academics, whatever, they don't really take women seriously. So I don't think this is a Putin issue. I think it's an issue of the culture and the society.
Can we speak about him on a more personal front? Politics aside, professional life aside, how do you think he would be described? How would his life be described?
Well, so I've had occasion, I used to go every year to a conference in Russia where they brought foreign academics and experts over, and we met with him and we had dinner with him and things like that. He's someone who it radiates, if you like, seriousness. He doesn't smile very much. He's very kind of businesslike. But he also, I think, is very much in command of facts, which he's interested in, and he can also be quite sarcastic when he wants to be.
We know that he's remained quite secretive about his family, especially as he's been rising the ranks and now the president. But has he been married? Does he have children?
So he was married for a long time. His wife was with him in East Germany and beyond that, and they had two daughters who are now probably around 38 and 40, and they have been coming into the forefront more. One of them is a scientist, the other one is running a tech company. And then there are lots of other rumors. So there are rumors that he has at least two other children with a woman who is an Olympic gymnast, and then with another child with a woman whom he knew in St. Petersburg. But it's again strictly shrouded in secrecy. None of this is public. The only thing that's public are his two grown-up daughters from his marriage, and then he subsequently divorced the wife.
Why does he keep it a secret about his girlfriends or his rumoured extra children, Angela? Is it mostly out of a privacy or a security situation?
Well, first of all, again, that's a Russian and the Soviet tradition. Certainly in the Soviet Union, there was very little public about the wives and children of the Soviet leaders. So this is a cultural tradition, if you like. And today, I think it's partly for security. And occasionally some of the media will publish things about, his younger children. And then those media outlets are immediately closed down and people are threatened. So this is part of the aura around him, where you're not supposed to know that much about him.
Can you walk me through what life is like in Russia right now for a normal civilian? Is it very much led by Russian oligarchs, by the Russian government, that are kind of ruling the roost? They've got most of the money, and then the rest, and then there's a discrepancy with the rest of Russia, the rest of normal civilians.
Right. So if you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you live quite well. If you're well employed, the restaurants are open, the cities have been beautified, and the people who live in the big cities, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg, those young men are not being drafted for this war. So they're leading a life which isn't that different from the life they led before the February 22 invasion, and they're in pretty good shape as long as they don't speak out against the government. Now, there are vast swathes of the country where people are really quite poor, places where people don't have running hot water all the time, where they don't have access to electricity all the time, where the education and the medical services are really not very good, particularly in areas where you have ethnic minorities. There are about 100 different ethnic groups in Russia, and those people have been disproportionately drafted and are fighting and dying in Ukraine. But for those people, at least in the last 3 years since the war has been going on, Putin has increased the pay for people who sign up to fight. If they're killed, their families get quite a lot of money. And for them, the choice really is between signing up to fight and living a life of poverty where there are very little access to jobs. So there's a huge discrepancy between the major cities in Russia where people live quite well, and then much of the rest of the country where people do not live well.
Do we have a ballpark figure, Angela, of how much a Russian soldier would be paid?
Well, right now, the people who sign up for these contracts are receiving what in Russia is thousands of rubles is a good salary, and much better than what they'd earn somewhere else.
How has, just a final question for you, how has Russia changed for the average civilian since Putin's come into power?
Well, for the average Russian, certainly in the first 8 years when he was in power, oil prices were rising, Russia was becoming much richer, and so their lives have materially got better. So for the average Russian, they look back on his time in power, the ones that are still in Russia, and again, 1 million Russians have left since the full-scale invasion in February, their life is materially better. But obviously, if you care about freedom of expression and things like that, then this has become a much more repressive society under Putin, and particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Angela Stent, thank you so much for joining the Putin Files today.
Thank you.